Welcome to this brief video lecture on interviewing as a form of interpersonal communication. This is a challenging chapter in the book because there is so much to interpersonal communication that one chapter cannot do justice to an entire topic on this, right? And interviewing is essentially a form of interpersonal communication. When we think of interpersonal communication, we should be thinking about the ways that we try to build rapport with others in order to elicit information and share information, at least in the context of interviewing. The slide right here is an image of Selena Meyer, who is a character from the show Veep, which is on HBO, or was on HBO. And the reason why I like to start this slide deck with an image of Selena Meyer is because as vice president in the TV show, she was always making huge faux pas in terms of her interpersonal communication. It wasn't just in interviews, and believe it or not, there are some very good episodes that focus solely on her and in interviewing, but also in her day-to-day communication interaction with her staff, with the public, which is always really painful to watch, and the way she interacts even with her family. If you have the opportunity to check out the show Veep on HBO, it's kind of, it's not as funny anymore considering the political signs of the time that we're living in, but if you're looking for that way to feel super uncomfortable when you're watching TV, similar to like a show like Curb Your Enthusiasm or The Office, I highly recommend you check out. So interpersonal communication is all about the dynamics of relationships and the way we build our relationships, and especially when we are talking in context to interviewing. There are several dynamics that we want to address on the slide that will highlight the effects of interviewing. And the first is power and control. Do you want to be seen as an interviewer who possesses the power and control? Do you want to steer the pathway of your interviewing interaction? You may want to do that if you are a police officer or a court judge or a lawyer, but maybe you don't want to do that if you are a therapist or a career counselor. Think about a journalist. The journalist is trying to get to the heart of the information as quickly as possible, but yet at the same time, they want their interviewee to feel welcome enough to share some emotion and pathos. So power and control is a tough one that you're going to need more than just one undergraduate course in interviewing to understand. The desire to collaborate is at the essence of the art of interviewing. If you come off as aggressive, abrasive, harsh, maybe exercising too much dominance and control, that's going to possibly negatively impact the amount of information you can receive from the interviewee. Do you seem like a likable interviewee, right? As the one who's answering the questions, are you smiling? Are you engaging in small talk? Are you using your hands to show some nonverbal cues of warmth and trustworthiness? Your desire to collaborate is probably the second most important item to express besides power and control, and actually has a lot to do with that. The art of identification, this is actually an old school rhetorical term that was explored by Burke, who is a famous rhetorician and communication scholar. He believed that people were more persuasive when they identified with the audience that they were trying to persuade. So if you are watching any of the political candidates on TV as we enter a political season, them using the term we, right? We must work together. We need to build a better America or a better state of New York. That sort of thing is going to possibly have more of the ability to persuade your audience. And that's the same thing with interviewers and interviewees. Trust, clearly, if you are attempting to elicit sensitive information, and we'll talk about the different levels of information momentarily, but level 2 or level 3, you're going to need to build trust, and that doesn't always happen in a first meeting or interaction. If those of you who have gone to therapy or gone to counseling, you understand it takes time to build trust between the therapist and the client. Self-disclosure, this goes along with trust. If you lack the trust, then you will not be as open to disclosing particular items that are asked of you in an interview, right? There are things that you may have been asked in job interviews before that are totally illegal. And sometimes job candidates don't know that. And so self-disclosure is a huge part. And remember, self-disclosure is all up to the power of the interviewee, essentially. And then finally, global dynamics, cultural differences. If you've taken intercultural communication in the CRS department before, you know that regions, countries, cities, depending on areas of the world that you're from, there are different dynamics at play when it comes to culture and society. And, if you are just looking at, for instance, a study was done in the early 1980s based on Italian Americans and German Americans and the way that they interacted in job interviews. Italian Americans believed in eye gaze and the ability to build warmth and trust with good eye contact. German Americans, believe it or not, actually did not prefer strong eye contact and were not interested in building warmth and rapport with interviewing candidates based on eye contact, right? And so that's just from an American context. I'm sure those of you who have traveled the world, you've been to other countries, you see how different particular regions or societies are compared to Americans, and those certainly have an impact on the ability to elicit particular pieces of information in interviews. So perception has a lot to do with it. How you perceive others affects how you approach the interview and how you react during the interview. And this can be skewed, this can be ambiguous, right? Self-perception, your perception of others, others' perception of you, and others' perception of oneself are four different dynamics at play when we're considering how we are received in an interview, either when we're the interviewer or interviewee. So you could have perceived that you bombed a job employment interview, but in all actuality, the self-perception you were holding was completely off or incorrect or wrong. And so perception has a lot of influence in interviewing interactions, and this is all in the eye of the beholder. It's all different. It's different. What I may perceive is fabulous is something that one of my students may not perceive as a nice, fabulous interaction. Levels of interaction. So I encourage you to look at this a little bit more deeply in the Stewart and Cash text. But levels of interaction, I just want to be as surface as plain as possible for the sake of time. The levels of interaction depend upon relational history and the purpose of the interview. We're going to be discussing several tragedies in interviews, and most of the time these tragedies that occur in interviews, whether it's a politician faltering through an interview, whether it's a messy job interview, it's because you have no relational history with the interviewer. And that interviewing is a rapport building process, believe it or not, which is why it's such a hard interaction to succeed at. And I want you to consider these levels, level 1, level 2, level 3 of interaction. A level 1 interaction is something that I may be working with my students on the first week, right? Where are you from? What's your name? What part of the world or the country did you travel from for this fall? Are you going to be solely online, or are you going to be attending on campus this year, right? Those are safe and casual questions. Notice age, sex, gender, affectionate orientation. Those have now moved up into a higher level of interviewing interaction because they tend to be more delicate and tend to be more sensitive topics in this day and age. And I think that we're moving to a place where we're trying to educate students, but also educate boomers, right? And older people, that there are certain topics in conversation that we need to be cognizant and sensitive to in terms of people's perceptions. Level 2, half revealing. This would be something maybe more of a political affiliation, right? Are you a Republican or are you a Democrat? Did you vote for Donald Trump? Did you vote for Joe Biden? Those are half revealing. Those are a little bit more intimate, a little bit more, concerning. But again, this depends on the person. If a student asks me who I vote for, I don't mind telling them, right? But it's not something that I would get up in front of the class and start saying, yes, I voted for Donald Trump last year, right? Or I voted for Hillary or something like that. Half revealing, again, level 2 can mean different things to different people. So I encourage you, again, to get knee deep in this chapter 2 of Stewart and Cash. The final level is personal and intimate, right? Those are things that maybe you wouldn't share with your professor or even your mom or your dad, right? Those are things that maybe you'd share with a best friend. Maybe you would reveal level 3 information with a therapist or a counselor, especially if it has to do with intimacy or sexuality. Those are things that typically you're not sharing on TV or you're going to share in a job interview. I mean, depending on the interview, of course. And then finally, this all wraps up into one thing called decorum. Decorum is all about the way we present ourselves in communication, the way we interact with participants in communication. So an example of decorum would be, how do you interact with your friends at a party versus your professor in office hours? Your decorum at a party is going to be much different. You're probably going to be wearing some different types of clothing. You're going to be maybe consuming alcohol or, talking more on the level of your friends. Maybe you're going to be swearing. If you are in an office setting with your professor, you're probably going to be saying, hi, Professor so-and-so, or hi, Doctor so-and-so. And you're probably not going to be consuming alcohol or, swearing to your professor. Or I don't know, maybe you are. Interviewing approaches. So interviewing approaches, there are 2 major approaches. Very simple, directive approach and non-directive approach. Before you begin each interviewing project, I want you to think about the goals of the project and the approach that you want to take, right? And most of these interviews, you're going to be honestly taking a directive approach. And so let's look at what the directive approach is. This means that the interviewer, right, the person who's asking the questions, are going to establish the purpose of the interview, and you are going to attempt to control the pacing, the interview climate, and the drift of the interview. So if your interviewee starts to go off topic, you can sort of recalibrate and reframe them to go back onto a topic of your choice. And you can do that by interjection or by reframing an interview question, or you could simply say, oh, I have another question I'd love to ask you, right? And we'll talk about those approaches and those strategies throughout the semester. Your questions will require brief but direct answers. Again, think about the types of interviewers that are most directive, right? Those would be the police officers. You get pulled over for speeding in a 30-mile-per-hour speed zone, not that I ever have, wink, wink. And you get pulled over, the police officer license, registration, where are you going? Why were you driving 50 miles an hour in a 30-mile-per-hour school zone, right? Those are questions where they want direct, simple, quick answers to. Some examples other than, of course, police officers, surveys, opinion polls, recruiting. That's because they want your answers to fit neatly into some type of category, or they need to be tabulated. And again, we're going to be talking more about that throughout the semester. The non-directive approach means that participants have control of the subject matter, the length of their answers, the interview climate, and the formality. This honestly is how a lot of therapists or counselors, career counselors, for instance. I'm a career counselor, and I normally do try a non-directive approach because it seems more open-ended, right? And there's more ebb and flow for conversation. Participants also appreciate open-ended questions, right? The interviewees prefer open-ended questions and neutral questions to give them the freedom to respond how they want, and allows for probing questions, flexibility, participant to volunteer more sentimental information. So just something to think about. Journalistic, oral history, and counseling interviews are examples. One interview that you are going to be taking on in which you may want to practice a non-directive approach is the pop culture interview, which you're going to be doing later in the semester. If you're interviewing someone based on, a performance or a dance routine or a comedy special, maybe you want to be more non-directive in your approach, so that way they feel more free to get sentimental about their artistry. Verbal interactions. So words are not neutral, and I can't say that this, in CRS 325 presentational speaking, we know words have meaning. Words have influence. That's why it's more important than ever in an interview to pay attention to the verbiage and pay attention to the terminology you're using. Talking is not the same thing as communicating. Communicating has a lot more to do with active listening, problem solution approaches to solving problems. Talking, when I think of talking, or Stuart and Cash frame talking, more as how's the weather, right? Did you water the plants today? Did you feed the cat? Those sorts of things. Communicating is more about opening dialogue between participants and trying to truly elicit information that's meaningful and conversational. Some verbal interactions, factors that are included in interacting are multiple meanings. So you could, name an utterance or say something that has multiple meanings and varieties to it that could be interpreted differently amongst audience members. Ambiguities, so that has a lot to do with maybe the tone we're using, right? So I may say, ugh, whatever, right? Now the term whatever really doesn't mean anything. It essentially means, okay, whatever, right? I don't care, or it's not a big deal. But the ugh, whatever, that has a lot of weight to it, right? And so that can be interpreted differently from other people. Sound-alikes, which are terms that, I'm sorry I misunderstood you, right? What does that sound alike? Jargon or slang, terminology that can often be discriminating. If I start using flowery words that you don't understand, that's going to tune you out, right? You're going to not listen to me anymore. So slang and jargon, we have to be careful when we're using those terminologies in interviewing. Naming, power words. By power words, I mean terms like slavery, democracy, enlightenment, pornography, obese, right? These are words that have a lot of meaning to them. They're not all shiny and wonderful, right? Some of them have a lot of negative connotation to it. So we have to be careful, but also understand the power of words and understand that certain words have historical context and meaning to it. And then finally down here, regional or role differences. I love the classic pop versus Coke or soda. Just in upstate New York, we have these, this bizarre linguistic transition from Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse to Albany to even the Hudson Valley. And depending on where you live or where you're from in upstate New York, you may call soda or pop or Coke something different, right? I call it soda. I grew up in the Hudson Valley. I live in Syracuse. I don't ever hear anyone call it pop. You go out to Buffalo or Rochester, chances are they're going to be calling it pop or pop. But if you go to New York City, they may be calling it Coke, or up in Plattsburgh. I'm not exactly sure about that. But regional and role differences have impact on the way we perceive information. And so we need to be cognizant of when we're going into an interview, how we are using our vernacular and our verbiage in a way so that it's not hurtful, it's not discriminatory, and we're trying to achieve maximum form of understanding. Reducing language problems during interviews. So the first rule here is to choose words and phrases carefully. That's why it's important to practice interviewing before you go into it. And I know that's hard to do sometimes if you're interviewing on a whim or an impromptu interview, but I highly encourage my students to practice and do your research, which will help in the way you choose words and phrases carefully. Expand your vocabulary. This is hard to do in an age of, we don't use dictionaries anymore, but you do have trusty thesaurus.com or some sort of thesaurus online. Try to evolve your language. Use this course as a way to try to build your vocabulary and try to use it in ways that make you sound more confident and diverse. Order your words carefully in sentences and thoughts. Look, I'm going to be honest, some of us are dyslexic, and that's hard to do. And I think just reinforces why practice is so important. And if you're someone like me, and I get very nervous, even I teach interviewing, I know how to interview. But look, if I had a job interview today, I'd still be nervous in my job interview. No matter how hard I practice, things may not come out particularly correct. Therefore, it's super important to pay attention to the way we practice our communication skills and try to rehearse before we go into an interaction. Listen to the context in which words are used. I think that's a problem that both the media and our politicians have, that there's this sort of distrust between the media and politicians right now. And let me be clear, that's always been there, but it's really heightened right now. And I think sometimes both the media and politicians misconstrue what they're hearing. And instead of taking the time to really think about the interview question and ask questions and how that question was framed, if they didn't understand it or if they're taking it offensively or personally, they would probably do a much better job at getting along, and the public would have a much better way of getting information from both the politicians and the media. And I'm not taking sides there, clearly. Learn the jargon of professions and groups, very important to do depending on the industry you're going into. If you're going into journalism, if you're going into healthcare or information management technology, you're going to want to learn the vernacular and the coded language and, frankly, the jargon that they use in those industries. So that way, not only you can better interview those people, or you can be interviewed in those contexts, but also that way you can interpret the information for lay audience as well. Lay audiences are people who don't understand the jargon, and we have an obligation as interviewers to make sure that we're explaining the interview topics in a way that is accessible to diverse audiences. That way it's more interesting. Keep up to date with changing uses of language. Look, this is something that I'm 30, I'm in my mid 30s, mid to late 30s, I'll say, and I still struggle with language that that younger people don't use anymore, right? And same with my parents. My parents may say, they're in their 60s, and they may say something that's either offensive or that is just not a term that's not used anymore. And we have to be willing to change with the times and update our vocabulary and the way we express our vocabulary. Know how the meaning of words may be affected by gender, age, race, culture, ethnic group, and situation. And that kind of follows up with what I was just talking about, that it's really important if you're going into an interview with the director of the LGBTQ Resource Center on campus, you're going to want to make sure that you've done your research and understand the terminologies that are used nowadays to express different genders and different bodies, different sexualities, and so that way you're able to not come across, I'm sorry to say, not come across as someone who doesn't understand, right? So it's super important, and that goes with all different types of people, societies, cultures, ethnicities, ages, races, that sort of thing. Nonverbal interactions. Look, nonverbal communication is an entire class at Syracuse University, and nonverbal, the thing that you have to understand about nonverbal interactions is that our nonverbal cues actually signal more than what's coming out of our mouths. And what's coming out of our mouths verbally and our nonverbal cues have to match up. If they don't match up, that signals to the audience that there's something wrong, whether it's deception, whether it's awkwardness or anxiety or uncomfortability. There are tons of things that can be communicated through a mismatch of verbal and nonverbal communication. Both parties are likely to detect what the other does and does not do correctly. Silence may encourage one to talk. It may signal that you are not in a hurry, or it may signal apathy, anger, boredom, or fear. We will learn in the next few chapters that silence is actually a really helpful tool at trying to extract pieces of information from people, right? And especially for those of us who are from New York City or New York or Boston or Philadelphia or Washington, D.C., silence makes us nervous, right? And so silence is a great strategy to learn, not just from an interviewer perspective, but an interviewee perspective. A single behavior act can convey a message, so we always have to realize that we're on stage. We're on camera, even if we're not being recorded. If we're in an interview, what we say, what we do, and how we act without even our words is going to convey a message. And that message it can be interpreted many different ways, but we have to consider that when we are engaging in communication. When we're interviewing, we want to show interest by nodding, leaning forward, maintaining quality eye contact. And the last thing I'll say about eye contact is that here in the United States, we are obsessed with eye contact. We use eye contact in a way to build trust, warmth, rapport. You know, I'm trying to find out if you're telling me the truth or you're lying to me about something. You know, if you are speaking with your parents or someone who's older than you, or to show signs of respect, you look at them in the eyes. That's challenging for international students, especially from, let's say, China, where eye contact has a different communicative meaning, or it can be interpreted differently. So if any of my international students are listening to this right now, please understand that in the United States, we're like bizarrely obsessed with eye contact. Nonverbal actions may reinforce or complement verbal messages, nodding while saying yes, or maybe a substitute for words or gesturing to signal. I'm going to skip this slide because this is a video slide, and I'm going to encourage you to check out this clip from Modern Family and see how mixed messages can be interpreted to an audience. And read that little blurb on mixed messages in the Stewart and Cash text. Building rapport. So when we talk about trust, warmth, goodwill in interviewing, rapport is essential. It's important, and it's hard for those interviewers or interviewees that have not met, that are you know, maybe have crossed paths in the past, maybe you know, you've only had one conversation, and so that's gonna sometimes tricky to get some quality information out from the interviewee. So think of these items: warmth through nonverbal cues, leaning in, smiling, quality eye contact, sitting up in a chair, having a nice comfortable location, identification, being able to understand the interviewee or the interviewer and trying to empathize with them, hence empathy and compassion. Territoriality. So this sometimes can be weird for guys, you know, or I should say women. Guys should never be touching women, right? Guys, just don't touch anyone, right? When you're interviewing someone, that if you put your hand on someone's shoulder or you know, on their knee or something, territoriality is the spatiality between the interviewer and interviewee, and this could be really awkward between opposite sexes and perceived genders. And so I'm going to say, for the men out there, you really want to consider the way respect and gratitude is shown to women and the way we speak to women. And look, I'm going to be honest, I was having a heated conversation with a colleague a few weeks ago, and I got so heated I called her honey, like, listen, honey. And I knew when I said that that was not right. And so, you know, it's really important that you show respect and that you think about gender communication, even though gender communication, again, is all over the place and is very diverse in terms of the perspectives there. The territoriality: are you sitting in a chair? Are you close to the interviewer? Are you, you know, sitting in open posture? Or do you have a desk that's dividing you guys? And then finally, character and credibility. And all these things speak to character and credibility. So lecture wrap up. Interpersonal communication within interviewing interaction is totally dependent on multiple factors, including power, control, identification, credibility, or character. That's what ethos is, and others. There are 3 levels of interaction: level 1, which is safe; level 2, which is half revealing; and level 3, which is totally intimate. And you want to consider those levels of interaction when you're interviewing. Mixed messages can cause conflict. I want you to, again, watch the clip from Modern Family and see how that relates to mixed messages. And then finally, building rapport is essential for gaining trust and gathering useful information. And so it's important to do your research and try to build rapport with the interviewer or interviewee before you meet.